Good morning. Boker tov. Shavuot tov. Almost Chodesh Tov. So one more day. Okay, so we are continuing on Hilchot Brachot. I think you'll agree with me by this point that Hilchot Brachot is somewhat complicated. So we have a lot of work to do ahead of us. I hope the conclusion of this year is not that people will stop eating and stop making brachot because they aren't sure what to do. That should not be the answer. As we've already seen, it's important. We'll reiterate. There are two scenarios whereby if a person is unsure of the bracha, there is sort of like the get out of jail free card, right? One is if you have bread at the beginning of the meal and you say hamotzi lechem haaretz, that is going to prepare all the food that you're going to eat. We'll discuss more. We started last week talking about the bracha and soup. As we'll see, it's very, very complicated. So if a person is eating bread with the meal and you have your bread, you said your hamotzi, you don't have to say a bracha and soup, which is why most people don't know what the bracha and soup is, because normally we eat soup with bread. But if we weren't, we'll discuss what it is. So that is one. The second one, which has come up a number of times, that we have certain cases of questionable brachot, and a person is really not sure if it's Borei Priya, if it's Borei Priya, if it's Shehakol, etc. So we said at least for the Eved, a person says Shehakol, and you have that would work. That would exempt your obligation as well for saying the bracha on a particular food. If one is really unsure, one can always say Shehakol, and that will be okay.
With that question,
yes.
If you use that as a catch-all for something that you don't know,
yeah,
right, then you eat something else after that you do know is the different bracha. We start the second one.
Very good. So we discussed that in the past. Again, it's a question which has come up, which is somebody doesn't know what the bracha is, so you say shehakol, but later on you have another food which is a borei praet. Would the shehakol that you then said cover the borei praet? So again, this is why one of the reasons why we have a specific order of brachot. So those brachot should have been said before. The answer to your question is it really depends on your intention. I mean, if the person has the intention that when you say a bracha, which is going to include everything that you eat, then it would cover everything as well. If a person knows what is the scenario whereby you would have to have something to break bread after hashakol. It might be a scenario where you're having a meal where you're not having bread and you know you're going to have dessert later on. You're expecting fruit for dessert. So if a person then has in mind, I'm now saying the shehakol in my main course, but I have in mind that this would not cover the fruit which I would have for dessert, then I would have to say an extra bracha on the fruit. If I say a shehakol and I have in mind I want this to cover everything I'm going to eat, so then that would be that would cover everything. Okay, so but as we said, and we said numerous times that it's preferable and it's ideal. Chazal make separate brachot for separate foods, more specific brachot. We understand there's a greater, perhaps level of praise. It's a greater way of giving thanks. You know, when you're more specific in terms of what it is. So we started discussing last week the bracha and soup on page 207. 207 in the book's version, volume 14. And what we saw the contradiction. We didn't quite resolve it yet. So we're on a cliffhanger for the last week. So we said like this: the contradiction was we have two separate sugyot in the Gemara, really one page apart in Masechet Brachot, which seem to contradict one another. 207 says the Gemara in source number 1 told us that Rav Papa said if you were to cook vegetables in water, the water that is left over, and you now take the vegetables out. We'll talk in a moment what happens if the vegetables are still there. It's going to get more complicated. But just the water itself, the broth, or what we might call soup, right? Just the water itself, said Rav Papa, if you cook vegetables in the soup, then the water that is left over has the same status as the vegetable. Meaning you cooked beets in water, the beet water that is left over, it has what you would say Borei Pri Adama on that water. It has the status of the vegetables that was cooked. However, the Gemara page before said, we'll talk about this. This is also going to be the source when we talk about fruit juices and things like that, honey, etc. What bracha do we say over there? So source number 2 on page 207 said, Amar bar Rav Ashi, Haydupsha de Tamli, Vavachina Elavesha Konia Bidbaro. The honey that comes from dates, right? Most of the time, by the way, in the Tanakh, in the Chumash, we talk about Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash, and of milk and honey, right? We talk about Dvash. We're usually talking about Dvash that comes from dates, not honey that comes from bees. Honey that comes from bees will also be Shehakol. But it says the honey here which comes from dates, the bracha would be Shehakol Niya B'Dvaro. Says the Gemara, why? My Tama. What is the reason for that? Answer is Zaya Ba'almo. It's merely moisture, but it's not the actual fruit. We consider it to be something which just emerges from it, not the essence of the fruit, just Zaya Ba'almo, as the Gemara says, and it'll be Shehakol. So you have a contradiction. On the one hand, you're saying that the actual liquid from the fruit itself, that is only going to be Shehakol. But on the other hand, you say that the water in which the fruit is cooked is going to have the same bracha as the fruit, whether it's Borei Eitz or Borei Adama, etc. That is the contradiction. That is the difficulty which all the Rishonim raise on this Gemara. We saw two primary answers, two primary ways of resolving it. Machloket between the Rashba and the Rosh. You can see this over the page on 208. The Rashba said the difference was in terms of what is the primary usage of the vegetable. In other words, where you have a vegetable which is usually consumed by cooking it, by boiling it in water, so there we say that that water which is boiled, that is the primary usage of the vegetable that is going to retain the bracha. However, where it's not the usual way is just to eat the food as it is, there is some moisture which was off it, or there is juice which was extracted, or there was even a liquid which was cooked, there it would not receive the bracha. That is what the Rashba says. It's based on our usage. What is the primary usage of that? The Rosh, on the other hand, in source number 4 said, no, it's got to do, in fact, with the taste. He says when you cook a vegetable in water, so you cook it for you cook it for a long time, you boil it, there is a transfer of taste. Afterwards, when I ask you, I say, what is this water? You don't relate to it as water. You relate to it as soup. You relate to it as it has the taste of that vegetable. It has a very, very strong taste, which is imparted, and therefore it would be Borei Prihadama or Borei Eitz, whatever it is, if you had cooked a fruit in the water. So explains the Rosh. Right? So the Rashba said, in other words, everybody agrees there is going to be a case. This is why we have a difficulty. We have a contradiction in the Gemara. We have times where we say the liquid in which the fruit was cooked or the vegetable was cooked retains the bracha of the original fruit or vegetable. We have times when we say that the liquid, that's in which it was cooked, in which it was placed, which was extracted, does not retain the bracha of Shehakol. Everybody agrees because those are two explicit Gemaras. What's the difference? When do we say A and when do we say B? So the Rashba says we say A if this is the primary way of cooking and cooking this vegetable, that boiling water retains the bracha. Says the Rosh, no, it's all got to do with if this is a way which imparts a very, very strong taste, whether you usually cook that vegetable or don't usually cook that vegetable. Somebody comes up with a new recipe for soup of a vegetable which no one's ever made soup from before, but you cook it and it has the taste, then according to the Rosh, you would still say the bracha of Borei Adama. According to the Rashba, you would not. So the Shulchan Aruch seems to have a nuanced position here. He seems to bring both of these opinions, and it's not clear which opinion is primary or not. Source number 5, at the bottom of 208. Says the Shulchan Aruch here in Siman Reish Hey. He says, Al Hamayim shebishlo ben yarakot, mevarech bracha atzma, shevarech al yarakot atzman. So he says, if you cook vegetables in water, you would say the bracha of the vegetables would retain its original bracha. And he just says that last sentence in the Shulchan Aruch, where it says, even though it contains nothing but the taste. In other words, there are not actual pieces of the vegetable that are left inside. This is just what we call the tamor velo mamashot. So that's in source number 5. Right?
What happens if you have with the vegetable meat?
We'll get to that. We've got enough. Yeah, it's a good question, but we have to one step at a time. We have enough difficulty with the vegetables before we bring the meat into it. I thought you were going to ask about kneidlach or croutons or etc. We'll get to that also. So that's but that's a good question. But over here, so says the Shulchan Aruch, if you cook the vegetables in water, then that water retains the bracha of the vegetable. Now, in source number 6, the Shulchan Aruch says that it's a little bit more complicated than that. He says, Perot shesra'an or bishlam b'mayim, you have fruits which you soaked or you cooked in water. Even though we now say that the taste of the fruit enters the water, we would still say the bracha of Shehakol. Okay, so that is clearly not like the opinion of the Rosh. The Rosh said if you have the taste in the water, you would say the bracha. So it says the Shulchan Aruch, not like the Rosh. And then he says, the The Rosh said that if you had the taste was in the water, you would say that separate bracha. Okay. In source number 5, the Shulchan Aruch didn't seem to make any distinction. He just said if you cook it in the water, you would say the bracha of the vegetables. In source number 6, he says no, you would say Shehakol, and there is an opinion that says you don't say Shehakol, you'd say. So what's the difference between? So it seems to be that the Shulchan Aruch is saying like the Rashba. Says the Taz in source number 7. He says B'siman Reish Bet, which is what we saw now in number 6. He says Nitpaer b'yesh machloket ben Rashba le'arosh u'mashma pasak ha'Shulchan Aruch sham v'yesh safek v'varach Shehakol. It says it seems in this source he said there are 2 different opinions, and he said you should say Shehakol. But even though in the other source we saw he says the bracha of the vegetable. The kan ma'ili midavar shedalko lebasher l'srot tebazeh modeh al rashba shevarech kamin ha'oi. Right, so he says that this Taz, source number 7, is relating to the Shulchan Aruch in Reish Hay, which we saw at the bottom of the previous page in source number 5. Says the Taz, what the Shulchan Aruch is dealing with there is a food which normally is cooked in that way, and then even the Rashba would agree that there you would say the bracha of Borei Pri Adama. So it would seem to be based on this that if you have soup where you have a vegetable which is boiled, again, we're just dealing with the liquid so far, but if you have a vegetable which is boiled in water, and that is the way that it is normally cooked, according to both, it's got the taste, it's the usual way it's eating, that would seem to be the bracha of Borei Pri Adama. Nonetheless, you can see there is a little bit of uncertainty between the psakim of the Shulchan Aruch, and therefore the Mishnah Berurah says in source number 8, he says Le'inyan halacha pasku achronim delekatchila yevarech Shehakol ubdiavad yimbarech Borei Pri Ha'etz yotzeh. In other words, it says that where we have says the Mishnah Berurah, this is referring to a case where we have fruits or something which was in water. He says since there is a bit of uncertainty about this, he says lekatchila say Shehakol, as we've already learned, Shehakol will certainly cover you for everything. It says in this case, as we discussed last week, where it actually was the fruits or vegetables that were soaked in the water, so even b'di'evet, the bracha of Borei Pri Ha'etz would still apply. But it seems to be like Atchila, it says that you would say Shehakol again. So that is when it comes to water in which fruit or vegetables were soaked or cooked, etc. Now, when we get to actual soup, it starts to get a little bit more complicated because for a number of reasons. We may have large pieces of vegetable within the soup. You may have other things in the soup, noodles, the like. What if you have a vegetable soup that was not produced in the way that we've just described, but rather it's based on powder? You have, we discussed, was it last week or 2 weeks ago, I don't remember, we discussed if you have a vegetable which is completely ground up and then it's reconstructed, so that may be different. Everything we've said so far relates to where actual vegetables were cooked in water. But what if it comes from a powder, so it's something completely different? So let's see the top of page 210. As you can see, just in the little box on the top of the page, it says, as far our discussion of soup and broth has held with the states of water alone. However, many of our soups today contain other components as well, which may affect which bracha is recited. Okay, we're going to see a number of contemporary sources now discussing this question. I'm not sure exactly what they ate in the days of the Rishonim or in the days of the Shulchan Aruch either. It seems their soup looks a little bit different to our soups, and that's why when it comes to our soup, we have more contemporary sources to deal with. But source number 9, you'll see here we have the Piskei Teshuvot, which is a contemporary collection of Teshuvot and comments going according to the order of the Shulchan Aruch. He says if we have soup that has pieces of actual vegetables within, he says yes לדעת. כי ואם אוכלת הפירות או הירקות אשר נתבשלו במים וכולי עלמא אינו צורך לברך כלל על מי הבישול אלא שותה עמהם. Right, so now if we have a vegetable soup which has large pieces of the actual vegetable in it, so in this case, he says you would say the bracha on the piece of vegetable, and that would be enough. The liquid that you're drinking, eating together with it, which comes from the vegetables, you've already said it's certainly a derivative of that. And yeah, there would be no doubt that you would say the bracha on the actual vegetable itself, and that would be enough. He says, even if, let's say, right, you've eaten all the large pieces of vegetable, now you have some of the liquid left, and you're just finishing off the bowl, would you have to make a new bracha there? It says no. this is what we'll learn in the next year in terms of the current tafel. We have that which is primary and secondary. At the very least, we would say that the liquid in the soup is secondary to the pieces of vegetable and therefore would not necessitate a second bracha. Even if it has right spices and water and other things as well. Okay, where it gets a little bit more complicated is if you have other components of the soup, somebody mentioned meat before, which are significant or separate, they've got their own taste, and it's not so clear that that is secondary to the vegetable. So we'll see what we say about that. Yeah. Right. So we discussed puree in the last couple of shiurim as well. I mean, if it is the original, I assume it would be the case with tomato puree, probably where the original form, texture, color, etc. of the, even though the fruit's completely ground up, but it's still recognizable that it is the same thing. And as tomatoes, then it would certainly, according to the Shulchan Aruch, it would definitely retain its bracha, and according to Ramah, probably as well in such a case. It's only where the fruit was ground up or crushed up completely to the point where it's no longer recognizable as the original substance, where there, the Shulchan Aruch said it probably still retains its bracha. The Shulchan Aruch said no, where we change it. I think so. I mean, you can still
be red, but it's really also your actions to it too. It's not just like the whole just
yeah, I think I would assume that. I mean, it's the tomato is recognizable as its original as its original form. Okay. But so before we get to the powder, so what about, you can see the second section on page 210, if we have soup with croutons, noodles, other grain-based foods, etc. Okay, now here it gets a little bit complicated, right? Because as we will learn, if you have croutons, noodles, kneidlach, the like, it's based on grain, which the bracha is mizonot. So usually, when we have two different foods, we have the current tafel, which we'll get into in subsequent shiurim. We have a primary food and a secondary food. How do we determine which is the primary food and which one would say the bracha? Sometimes it has to do with what has a larger component. Sometimes it has to do with other factors. But usually speaking, if one of the foods is borei or not, that we would consider that to be primary, right? So would we say the same thing when we have a bowl of soup, but you only have a small amount of croutons? So again, it seems a little bit far-fetched to say that just a few croutons that you have in an entire bowl of soup with the vegetables and the meat and everything, that the croutons are the primary. Sometimes you have a situation. I remember when we were kids, and soup croutons first came out, and the vegetable soup. Nobody wants the soup, but you eat the soup in order that you can have the croutons. So that's something different. But that's usually not the case. So have a look in source number 10. This is and again, here we are dealing with these croutons, noodles, whatever it is, was not part of the original soup. It's a vegetable soup that was cooked, and you're adding them afterwards. It's that's the way it's normally done. So it says, after you have the soup, which is completely cooked, you add it in certain types of grain products. Right, all different options. Take your pick. So if your croutons, in the example that we just gave, or your noodles, whatever it is, are actually the majority of the food proposed into the soup, and you're eating, the soup is just an excuse to eat the croutons, so then you would say borei minei mezonot, and that would be the primary food, and that would be an. However, what is probably more common? You don't have so much. Right? You have one kneidlach in a bowl of soup. And your intent is therefore to eat both the grain product and to eat the soup. So then in such a case, we would say that you okay over here. Let's assume right now we're talking about chicken soup. We'll get back to the vegetables. The chicken soup, which would obviously be shehakol. So he says there you would say Borei minei mezonot on the mezonot, and you'd say shehakol for the man. נכון מיראי שמיים נחמיר לעצמו לברך שהכל על דבר אחר ולפתור מרק, ועל כל פנים יברך קודם שהכל על המרק ואחר כך יברך בורei minei mezonot על המזונות. Okay, why is this so complicated? Again, because here we have, again, we're leaving out our vegetables for a moment. We have ordinary chicken soup, and we have noodles or knedlach or whatever, which is borei minei mezonot. So on the one hand, we say that we have two separate foods. We have two separate, and each one has a distinct taste. Right? There's a reason why the person adds in the knedlach or the noodles or whatever, because you like that taste that has a separate taste, and therefore you have two separate foods. Yeah. On the one hand, you would say that the mezonot would be primary, and therefore you would just say the bracha on the mezonot. On the other hand, here it's not really primary. It's not the majority. You've got, but mezonot by its nature is usually the primary food, and therefore you would have to say the mezonot on the mezonot, and it would seem that you need to say shehakol on the soup as well. But since there's somewhat of a doubt, the better thing to do would be either if you say the shehakol first, so then you definitely would have to say it. Or you would say shehakol. The Mishnah Berurah brings this advice as well. You would say shehakol on something else that you're eating separately, and then there's no question. You said that when it's not, you said the shehakol, and that is fine. What about where this is in vegetable soup? This is one moment. Marak yirakot, the last paragraph. So you have vegetable soup together with the knedlach or whatever it is. So mevarech borei minei mezonot ala mezonot. Okay, so here again we have pieces. We have a soup that has got tomatoes in it, and it's got pieces of vegetable. So in that case, easy. You would say the borei minei mezonot on the knedlach. You would say the borei pri ha'adama on the pieces of vegetables, and that would cover the rest of the soup as well. You would not say separate shehakol. Then you would not say the separate beracha on the soup itself.
It's easier to say on the soup.
Yes, I said that at the beginning. Definitely.
Yeah. I don't know if this applies globally, but in our family, like neighbor are put together with the soup to get the taste of the soup. But these songs, as the whole last minute, people are eating.
Yes.
They're effectively eating despite the fact that
yeah.
But they'll still be eating the same way.
Yeah. So if it was cooked together with the soup, so that is a little bit more questionable, and that becomes more of a doubt. And therefore, in the case where it's cooked together with the soup, the best practice would be to say borei minei mezonot. And if I don't say something else to ensure there's no doubt. Yeah.
And you're not taking the broth on the soup. I'm not even saying broth. I'm having soup. Take what I in. So even though I gave a broth on the tomato and a meat, not making a broth on the soup.
Is that right? So wait, what are you saying? You're saying you should say the bracha on?
Also on the soup. If you're making the broth on the tomato,
no, so he's saying over there, right? He's saying in the case of vegetable soup, where the bracha on the vegetables is equivalent to the bracha on the soup. That's building on the previous section. In other words, we said if you have a vegetable soup based on water and vegetables, so the large pieces of vegetables, which are the same thing, which is what gives the flavor to the soup, and therefore there is an opinion even in the Rishonim that water itself would have the bracha of borei pri ha'adama. So bringing all those factors together, once I say the borei pri ha'adama on the vegetables, that is enough for the soup. So essentially he's saying, I am saying the bracha on the soup, but that's the borei pri ha'adama. So I don't have to say a separate shehakol as well. The fact that I'm saying a separate bracha on the knedlach, I'm saying borei minei mezonot, so then you might think, well, I'm saying on this piece of knedlach, I'm saying on this piece of vegetable, maybe I should say on the liquid as well. Saying no, that doesn't change. We don't say separate bracha on the liquid.
So the thinking is those are saying that it's better to use shehakol first and then you know doing that shehakol against everything. So you still have to have in mind the food you're doing.
Right. So that's so that's correct. That's why this is more of a b'diavad scenario. I mean, the better advice would be to say shehakol on something else and keep the right order of the bracha. If you were to do it separately, yes, that's the point. You would say, in this case, you'd say shehakol, which has in mind just for the soup and not for the Kenigsberg, and then you could say the in order to get around. But as you say, that raises all these other issues. So the best thing to do is say the Borei name is on first, to say shehakol on something else. Again, if it's the vegetable soup, you don't need to say shehakol on something else because you just say the Borei. Okay. What if the vegetable soup has never seen a vegetable in its life, right? What if it comes from a powder? And then it's a little bit different, and then it's going to depend how many vegetables we have as well. Let's turn over the page, source number 11, which is Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, which is another contemporary sefer on Hilchot Brachot. He groups this into 3 different cases. Let's see what he says. He says, Marak Yirakot HaMekubal Kayom. Umarak Shekarta Amon Atzor Me'avkat Marak. So again, a person has to be aware and know how this is made. He says the most common thing today is that it comes from powder. I don't know. You can I'll leave you to argue afterwards whether that is the reality or not. But nonetheless, he says in such a case that so now you have the powder, which you need to say shehakol, and you have the extra pieces of vegetable which are added in, which would be borei pri adama. You have 2 separate brachot. So the echad me'em nikar v'sheni tafer, v'vorech al ha'ikar u'poter ot ha'tafer, v'din ze nechlak l'shlosha matzavot. Okay, so now when we have 2 components, we always have to ask, is this going to be a scenario? It's not always so clear cut. This is where things get complicated. We'll see more next week as well. But if I have 2 components, there are certain cases whereby each, if I have, just to explain this, we're talking about a current affair. So a person sitting on Friday night dinner, and you have on your plate, you have chicken and potatoes on your plate next to each other. Okay, there we would not say a current affair, right? 2 things, I'm eating them together, it's on the same plate. No, they're separate foods. There's the chicken, which is shehakol. There's the potatoes, which is borei pri adama. Okay, you wouldn't say either bracha because you said how much lechem and haaretz on the. But the point is they are considered 2 separate foods. But sometimes when I have 2 foods that are together, then it's considered as one. Even though they are separate pieces, one is considered primary, one is considered secondary. That's the current affair, which again raises many questions. We'll get into more details. But so yeah, the question is in the soup. How do I relate to it? Do I relate to the vegetables and the liquid as one entity, which would only require 1 bracha? Do I relate to it as one is primary and one is secondary, and therefore do I relate to it as one entity whereby one is primary and one is secondary, and therefore I would only need 1 bracha? Do I relate to it as, well, I want the vegetables, I want the soup as well, I need to say 2 brachot? Okay, so it's going to depends on the makeup of the soup. And he says like this, 3 possibilities. Aleph, we're on page 212. So if the vast majority, the significant majority of the soup is liquid, yes, but you have a few pieces of vegetable, right? It's not the main thing of the soup. So then, there we would say that the vegetables themselves are going to be tafel, are going to be secondary to the soup, and you would only need to say the bracha of shehakol. Shehakol would be enough, and that would include the soup and the vegetables within it. Again, we're talking here about a powder-based soup. If the soup was made only from vegetables in the first place, this wouldn't apply. So that is one scenario. Second scenario, this is the complicated one. Bet, imrubon nozel, the majority is still liquid, is soup. And yeah, you have a significant minority of, so in order to measure how much there's more liquid than there is vegetable, but the vegetables, they may be larger pieces, they maybe have a more significant taste. In this case, even though the vegetables are the minority, since they have the significance in and of themselves, yeah, we'd say, this would be a case, not everybody agrees with this. Not everybody agrees with this. This is a somewhat gray area, but he says this would be a case whereby you have you don't say ikar and tafel. You look at each one on its own, and therefore and in that case you would say borei pri adama on the vegetables, and you would say shehakol on the soup. As I say, the Piskei Teshuvot I think disagrees with this. This is the complicated case. So we find this as well where this comes up. There's a machloket between the Mishnah Berurah and Chayei Adam as well when it comes to fruit salad, for example. They're very, very similar case. What happens very often You have a fruit salad, you'll have within it fruits which have the bracha of Borei Pri Ha'etz, and fruits which have the bracha of Borei Pri Ha'adama. Now, each one has got its, on the one hand, each fruit has got a separate piece. You could pick up each one by itself. On the other hand, you eat, say to you, what are you eating? You don't say, I'm eating apples and oranges and bananas and pineapple. I'm eating fruit salad. It's all one thing. So there's a big question. Would I say, you can find poskim on both sides of the argument. There are those who would say you need to pick up a piece of bread, take up the two pieces, eat them separately, and say the two brachot. There are others who would say, no, this is one entity. I have to determine which is primary and which is secondary. Again, how do we do that? We'll come back to it. And then I would only say one bracha, and that would exempt everything. As you can guess, most of the poskim say best thing to do in such a scenario, find something else to eat first and say the brachot, so we don't have a separate. But I'm just bringing that example to show, yeah, in the case of the soup, it could be the same thing. Now, how do I do it? So that is this middle case, which is somewhat a gray area. Not everybody agrees that there is such a case. But we take the two extremes, it's far more clear cut. The first one we said, if it's the majority of soup, you have small pieces of vegetables here and there, but it's a minority, we say the shehakol in the soup, that would be enough. What if it's the other way around? What if the majority is the pieces of vegetables? You've got some liquid in it as well, but you've got the actual pieces of vegetable, and that's the main component. So he says here in Gimel, in Karov lechatzim marak v'yirakot, if close to half of the soup is vegetables, where it's clear to you. Again, a lot of this is going to be subjective, but when a person looks at it, what do I call it? How do I relate to it? What is that I'm eating? This is I'm eating the vegetables, with the soup. Again, the soup for the vegetables. So in that case, so then you would just say the beracha v'adama on the vegetables, and that would be enough. And again, here he says, if you finished all the pieces of vegetables, there's still a few spoonfuls of the liquid left, as we said before. That would be okay. You would not need to say separate bracha on those. When it comes to the bracha after eating, so he says, is that you probably wouldn't say a bracha on soup in any event because it's liquid and you've not consumed enough of a quantity in terms of the amount of how much you would drink in one go. If you had eaten of the vegetables, but enough of the amount, which would always necessitate the amount within the time frame, it would necessitate a bracha, one would say that for a pressure. Okay, so to sum up, what we've seen when it comes to soup is the following. If the soup is made just from the actual vegetables, so we said if, and certainly if you have pieces of vegetables within it, then the bracha would be Borei Pri Ha'adama. That is clear. If it is just liquid, then the bracha would be then one should say shehakol. If you have croutons, kanedla, etc., grain-based food, which are Borei Minanos or not, one would be required to say Borei Minanos or not on that component, and if it's vegetables, actual vegetables, then you would say Borei Pri Ha'adama, and that would be enough. If we are dealing with a powder-based soup, and which has components of actual pieces of vegetable in it as well. So then we would look at what is the current, what is tafel. If it is primarily the liquid, we'd say shehakol. If it is primarily the vegetables, we would say Borei Pri Ha'adama. If it's unclear what is primary and what isn't, so that is a bit of a safek amongst the poskim. And best thing to do in such a scenario, have some bread at the beginning, right? Okay. So that is in terms of the bracha on soup, more or less. Now, we began this whole discussion. If you go back to page 207 for just a moment, we began with a couple of sources in the Gemara. We saw source number 2, which we kind of glossed over. We discussed it for our purposes, but it is very relevant coming to some other halachot as well. That the date, the honey which comes from the dates, the bracha over there is shehakol miyad b'paro. In other words, we relate to the moisture, or we relate to the juice, which comes from a fruit, as what's called zeh ba'alma, and that would be a separate entity, and that would be the bracha of shehakol. And this is now going to come to the question of what happens when we have other types of fruit juices. Again, a lot of these were not so common in the days of Chazal. There were certain fruits which we know that they would extract the liquid from. Obviously olives, olive oil, obviously grape juice and wine. But this relates to the melacha of shechita when it comes to Chot Shabbat as well. Other sorts of fruits, it seems, was not necessarily so common that they would be the juice would be extracted from them. Nowadays, we have all sorts. So source number 12, going back to page 214. The first question is, when the Gemara says that the juice which comes out of the dates is just Shehakol Ni'abid Baro, does that mean that any fruit that I have that I extract the juice from will be Shehakol Ni'abid Baro? Or is there something different going on here? So two ways to understand the Gemara. Says the Beit Yosef in source number 12 on page 214. He says, Pilshu the Mailish Natana Tocho Main. He says, that case, you should know, where we say that the honey which comes from the dates, the bracha is not Borei but rather Shehakol. He says that is referring to, there are those who understand that it's a case where you added water. It's not just the juice by itself. Efshar, what? The Efshar the Dama de Gaon, right? The Gaon who writes, this is quoting the bag. The Mishom the Bekraktiv Udvash, the Loktiv Tmalim. Right, when the Torah is talking about the 7 species of the Eretz dates, honey, right? Eretz Shemen Dvash, and therefore he says, "Can cry bidvash hazav me'elav minat malim ubichlal shivat haminimu u'barechal borei praet." If the Torah is talking about these fruits, and if the way it refers to the dates is as honey, so you learn from that the honey that comes from the dates is not considered as Zeh Ba'alma, but it's considered as the actual fruit. It's considered as the dates, and therefore it should be Borei Praet. So what does it mean when the Gemara there says Shehakol? It means if you added water to it. Okay, what would that mean regarding other species? Not those would be different. Right, but that is the bahag, and he says that pure date honey would therefore be subject to the bracha of ha'etz. However, other Rishonim aren't so sure about that. Tosfot, you can see source number 13, says Haiduvsha detamim v'achin alei shehakol v'chein mashkin mikol minei peirot v'mitosh v'yitzal kidawen agabe'olam. He says that would be the case. I mentioned already that when it comes to tirosh, which is oil, which comes from olives, or wine, which comes from grapes, those are separate. Those have got a separate dinim regarding orla, regarding the Shabbat. Those are in a category of their own. But Tosfot understands all other fruits, including the honey which comes from dates, would be the bracha would be Shehakol. And says the Shulchan Aruch as well, source number 14. He says Tvash hazav me'atmalim avoich alav Shehakol. Essentially, the liquid, the honey that flows from dates, the bracha would be Shehakol. V'chein al mashkin hayotzim mikol minei parot. And the juice which comes from any other fruit, with the exception of olives and grapes, as we've said, but the bracha would be Shehakol. Okay, so based on that, any sort of fruit juice, and again, obviously we're not talking about processed fruit, etc., but naturally squeezed orange juice, apple juice, whatever it is, the bracha would be Shehakol. Now the Chazon Ish has an interesting suggestion over here in source number 15. Chazon Ish says that if you were to take the fruit and you were to crush it, we've already learned that if you take a fruit or vegetable and you crush it completely, and with Shulchan Aruch or the Ramah, but certainly if it retains its identity or retains its taste, or if the fruit was grown in such a way in order to be crushed, that it would retain its bracha. So he suggested maybe if you were to take an orange and you were to squeeze the entire thing, right, and convert it into juice, then maybe that would at the very least retain the same din as this crushed fruit, and therefore would still be Borei Praet. He's not conclusive about it in the end, but it's an interesting discussion. Number 15, he says, if you were to squeeze an entire orange and all the fruit goes into the cup, all that remains is just the waste. He says, remember that there was a machloket as well in terms of crushing the fruit. There were those who still say that you would say Shehakol, but there is an opinion that it still is Borei Praet. And even if you say that no, it's not considered crushing, you're just extracting the juice from the fruit. He says, "Adayin b'machloket shnuya." That Rashba, the kol sherov meshamshin oto lotzia mashkin chashiv pilei. He says, but didn't we learn, according to the Rashba, so the machloket rishonim, but according to the Rashba, that if it was the primary method of eating this food, he said before, by cooking vegetables or by extracting the juice from the fruit, that it would still retain its bracha. And therefore he says, so he says it's possible in this case that it would still be pre-pri'et, but tzarech. At the end of the day, it's inconclusive, and the vast majority of poskim do not accept the Chazon Ish on this. You can see in the footnote on page 216, Shev Daledi or Avozna or Lezion of Benzion Abashor or Shom Zamanayabach, what Vanagod of Sternbach, Sefer Zota Bracha, and this seems to be in also halachot of Brachot Rav Bodna, which is another contemporary sefer. The vast majority, the halachic consensus seems to be that on fruit juice, with the exception of grape juice or wine, the bracha would therefore be Shehakol. Even if it is a fruit mainly growing for its juice, nonetheless the bracha would still be Shehakol. So, speaking of the bracha of Shehakol, page 217. So this is the easiest one to determine. Right? Anything that doesn't fit into any of the other categories, that's all we've got left. So you see the Shulchan Aruch of the Yan, Siman Rishtalet, says Davar she'en gidulo min ha'aretz, kegon basar ve'emar chayav orok, dagim beitzim chalav gvina upat she'epsha. So interesting, the last category. He says anything which is not grown on the ground, such as meat, chicken, fish, eggs, milk, cheese, etc. The last one he adds in pat she'epsha, which is bread that has become stale. Again, things have changed a lot in the last 500 years. And Baruch Hashem, we take it for granted, but we don't have to go back 500 years, go back much shorter period of time. The amount of shefa and the luxury that we have in terms of the food that we eat and the food that we throw away, and what we're able to, we don't have to think about food that's gone stale, but still eating it. Once upon a time, bread had gone stale, okay, so that's what you have to eat, so that's what you would eat. So if the bread had gone stale, it would no longer be, you would say Shehakol on the mold. But thankfully nowadays we're probably not eating that. An interesting one as well, which not everybody is aware of, is pitriyot, which are mushrooms. Even though it seems that mushrooms grow from the ground, the Gemara says that they get their sustenance. In fact, the fungus, they get their sustenance from the air. They don't absorb from the nutrients from the ground itself. We can discuss scientifically whether it's accurate or not, and whether it matters if it's accurate scientifically, but that's the way that Chazal perceived it, and that is the way that the halacha was established. So mushrooms are Shehakol, but essentially we have two categories, as you can see here, of food which is Shehakol. There is something which does not fit into any of the other previous categories, the Shehakol, and then even those that do fit into the previous categories, but were significantly transformed, in a sense like the Patshe Psha, or like fruit which has been crushed up, etc., that we've discussed. And I mentioned before as well that if you have a fruit which is eaten not in its normal way, but something which is only eaten raw and when it ate it cooked, or vice versa, that would then become Shehakol. I'm not talking about fruit which could be eaten raw or cooked, would still retain the bracha no matter what. So carrots is probably a good example of that. Apples are a good example of that. You can cook, you can eat them raw, so they would still be whatever it is. Says the Shulchan Aruch, source number 19 over the page. Right, there's called davar shum supak b'birkato yivach shehakol. Any case, as we've already mentioned, we're uncertain of the bracha one could say shehakol, and it explains the Mishnah Borei. The b'diavad yotzei b'shehakol al kol davar v'kan kevan mesupak b'diavadam. Once a person's uncertain, it's b'diavad, but better to say Shehakol, even if it's the wrong bracha, than to eat without a bracha. That would be much more problematic. Okay, the final halacha which we'll discuss for now is an interesting question, and it may surprise you to hear that there is actually a machloket rishonim on this point, which is, can one say a bracha on non-kosher food? So it would seem intuitively that it would be a davar pashut, that one should not say a bracha on a non-kosher food. It's not so clear. The opposite will say one could ask the obvious question: why are you eating non-kosher food? Okay, so please don't misquote me. You're not allowed to eat non-kosher food. I don't want to come out of this. Rabbi Kenigsberg said we can. No, I did not say that. But so there are a couple of scenarios where this could be. One could be, but we're relating not just to bracha rishona, but we're relating to bracha achrona as well, bracha afterwards. So say a person's in a situation where that happened inadvertently, they made a mistake, they were given something, they thought it was kosher, obviously you have to check that the food you're eating is kosher, and you have to take all the precautions. It happens. There have been times where somebody ate something which they thought was kosher, or they ate some agricultural produce and only found out afterwards that trumot and masrot, etc., had not been taken from it, so it's forbidden food as well. In such a case, would one then be required to say, but we would assume, so in such a case, you said the bracha rishonah, okay, might be a question now whether the person has to do tshuva about saying the bracha rishonah, tshuva about the fact that you ate the food, which you shouldn't have, but you said a bracha, is that now considered a bracha levatala or not? That's an interesting philosophical question. But should you say a bracha afronah? You've eaten the food, you've now discovered it was actually forbidden. Can you say a bracha over the forbidden food? That is one scenario. Another scenario may be where, for the purposes of pikuach nefesh, a person has to eat food which is not kosher. They need it for their health. It's the only food, the only medical treatment that is available is this certain food. Might be on Pesach, a person needs to eat something which is I don't know. Would you then say a bracha over there? Another case where this might come up, interesting, is actually, I think towards the end of the shir, you'll see sometimes we have the response again from the Maral Bazak, written by the Eretz Chemda Institute, which I have the privilege of being a part of. Not this particular tshuva, but there's a question over here on page 231, somebody who is a Baal Tshuva, and somebody who's beginning the process of becoming a Baal Tshuva. They're in this particular question was asked in Ukraine, somebody growing up in their parents' house, and they don't have the possibility of switching over to kosher food. That's all that they can eat, right? So, but should they make a bracha or not? So the question does come up and has various expressions. So says the Rambam, we're on page 219. Says the Rambam in Ilchot Brachot, source number 21. He says, Kol ha'ochel davar asur, ben bezadon ben b'shkaga, einum v'ech alav lo b'tchila v'lo b'sur. Says the Rambam, if you're eating a forbidden food, you don't say a bracha. Okay, whether it is bezadon or b'shkaga, whether it was intentionally or inadvertently, you don't say the bracha beforehand or afterwards. So see, when it talks about b'shkaga, again, first of all, you'll ask, if a person's eating bezadon, person doesn't care about eating kosher food, are they going to care about saying the bracha? Sometimes, people do strange things. Sometimes people have their priorities a little bit in the wrong order. Sometimes people are very macular one thing, not another. It could be the case as well that we spoke about of somebody who is a Baal Tshuva, but is unable to, doesn't have access to kosher food. But nonetheless, they want to say the bracha. Man Brachot says that a thief, when he's about to steal, he says he davens to Hashem. He says, ask that then should be successful. Maybe over here as well. So that is bezadon, b'shkaga, inadvertently. If it's inadvertent and you don't know it's kosher, clearly the person is, we assume, going to say the bracha beforehand, but there would seem to be afterwards, right? They ate it b'shkaga, it was inadvertent, so they say the bracha. But the Rambam is clear and he's conclusive. One would not say a bracha over food which was not kosher, and he gives different examples. Now the Ravid, as we know, had many machlokot with the Rambam. Over here, source number 22, the Ravid in his Hasagat says, Kol ha'ochel davar asur, adov b'tchila v'lo b'sur. He says, ta'ab b'zeh ta'ut gedola. Sometimes you read the way the Rishonim spoke about each other. If anybody was to speak about the Rambam like that today, we chuck them out of the Midrash. But says the Ravid, this is how they spoke to each other. He says he made a very great mistake, the Rambam. Now we have a Mishnah in Brachot, you see it underneath, which says that if somebody had a non-kosher food, whatever it was, you cannot establish a zimun together with that person. So says the Ravid that the Mishnah was telling us that non-kosher food is not considered such that you can establish a meal over it, and therefore you can't make a zimun. So the Rambam extended this to say you can't say a bracha as well at all. But says the Ravid, I believe that is incorrect. Last sentence in the Ravid. Okay, he says, why should you not say a bracha? You got benefit from this world. Very interesting. Very interesting. Says the Ravid. If you turn over the page, on top of page 222, you'll see this is the Gemara in Brachot. The Gemara says, right in the last paragraph, Rabbi Levi Rami, the Gemara says we have a contradiction. The Torah, in one place, Tanakh I should say, it says in Tehillim. The other pasuk it says, Hashem haaretz umloa. The entire world, the entire universe belongs to Hashem. Another pasuk says, Shamayim Shamayim Hashem, v'ha'aretz natan livnei adam. Says that Shamayim, the heavens, were given to Hashem, and the earth was given to people. Hang on a second. You just said Hashem haaretz umloa. So which is it? Does the earth belong to Hashem, or does it belong to us? What's going on? Contradiction in terms. The Kotzka had a famous scripture over this pasuk. He said, Hashemayim, Shamayim, Hashem, the heavens are given to Hashem, the earth is given to man to turn it into Shamayim. But there was the Kotzka. But in any event, going back to our case, it says, Lo kasha, the Gemara says, Kan kodem bracha, kan nachal bracha. Because the difference is whether you've made a bracha or not. Before bracha, the world belongs to Hashem. If one was to take something, to take anything and benefit from this world in a tangible way, that is equivalent to taps me'ilah, that is equivalent to theft, that is equivalent to stealing from Hashem's world. You're not allowed to benefit from it. But after the bracha, that's when they say, the world was first command, it was given to the first person, right? It was go out and eat from the fruits, benefit from the world. We're allowed to benefit from it, but only after we've made a bracha. So says the Ravid, you're stealing from the world, you're benefiting. At the end of the day, you're getting physical sustenance. What's one got to do with the other? Then you should still say the bracha. Says the Rambam, what are you talking about? You can't, you steal. At the end of the day, you're still stealing. You're still benefiting from something that you're not meant to and you're not allowed to. It seems to be a contradiction in terms to say the bracha. So says the Shulchan Aruch in source number 30 at the bottom of page 223. He says, "Achal davar isur, af al pi she'eino asur ela midrabanan, ein mezamnin alav ve'ein varchin alav lo b'tchila v'lo b'sur." Says the Shulchan Aruch that if you eat forbidden food, and it doesn't matter whether it's forbidden midoraita or midrabanan. There's the one mentioned of the mitzvot, I believe, who says the difference between mitzvot doraita and the difference between mitzvot rabbanan is that the actual object on which something is forbidden or something is consecrated, that can only be where if there is a mitzvah from the Torah that can change the status of the object, whether as opposed to a mitzvah midrabanan, they can change the status regarding me, but it doesn't change the object itself. But therefore there might have been room to distinguish between something that's forbidden doraita or rabbanan. Nonetheless, Shulchan Aruch says you have forbidden food, whether it's forbidden doraita or forbidden rabbanan, for whatever reason, you cannot say a bracha on it, not before and not after. Says the Mishnah Berurah. Now there are other opinions, as we saw. This is the machloket between the Rambam and the Ravid. So says the Mishnah Berurah in source number 31. He says, "Im achal b'shogeg v'niskar achar achilato." Right. So it's clear to everybody that if beforehand you know the food is forbidden and you shouldn't be eating it, and if for whatever reason you are eating it, you shouldn't say the bracha. What about the more nuanced case where a person ate the food accidentally and then discovered it was actually forbidden? Should you say the beracha achrona afterwards? Well, clearly the Rambam says no. Right? It says yes. It says the Mishnah Berurah, Data Taz, V'od Kam Achronim, D'vazeh Yuchal Levarech B'sov. There are those who say, in fact, that you can, because D'vazeh Lo Sheach Naot Elav D'Leinyan Zimun, V'le B'shogeg Nezamen Al Zeh, B'chalat Isur Lo Chashiva K'viyot. So you would not be allowed to perform a zimun. The Mishnah Berurah says, in that case, he says we have what to rely on, that one could still say the bracha achrona. Again, hopefully we're not going to get into that case. The other question is, the Rambam seems to give a blanket rule, but what if a person is eating this forbidden food because they're allowed to? The Torah said in such a case, pikuach nefesh, this food for you right now is not forbidden. You have to eat it. Over there, do you still say the bracha? Again, the logic we could see the story both ways. So says the Beit Yosef. In number 32, he says, right? According to the Rosh, who holds like the Ravid, who says that in any event you say the bracha on forbidden food, that would be fine. But the Rambam says no. Now in bold he says meal. Says the Beit Yosef, I could see the logic to say that the Rambam is only saying not to say the bracha because it's forbidden, but where it's not forbidden, the food itself would normally be forbidden, you could say the bracha, and that is how he passes the Shulchan Aruch, source number 33. He says, so if somebody eats or drinks something which is ordinarily forbidden, but they are allowed to, they have a license in that case because of danger, so then they would say the bracha beforehand and afterwards. Okay, which beracha, Shehakol, Borei, etc. that we've already seen. So I've come for today. Next week, B'ezrat Hashem, we will begin. That we'll finish it, but we will begin shir number 7, which is the last shir in the book. We're going finally talking about this question of the karvat afel. We have the primary food and the secondary food. If it's in the same food, if it's in different foods, etc., and which bracha would be sent. So I'd come to today. Yeah.
And you have a get, and you have a get to only move